Okay, all right, awesome, Dallas. So thank you guys for putting your name in, and I hope you enjoyed the book too. I think it's a great read, and we're just I'm gonna give my AV guy a little bit of permission here to change the screen. Our next speaker, Caroline Hilton, had an opportunity to put a few slides together literally 5 minutes ago, and so my AV friend here is going to get things loaded up. But I want to introduce Caroline. We had a chance to connect. I don't know, maybe it's probably 6 weeks ago, and Christy, who you just saw on stage, said, I think we have a great keynote here who can really set the stage on Indigenomics and really round out the theme of our conference. So I'm humbled to be able to introduce you to Caroline here today. And Caroline is the CEO and founder of the Indigenomics Institute and the Global Center of Indigenomics. She is the Nuu-chah-nulth descendant from the Hisquila Nation in Vancouver Island. And she wrote this book on Indigenomics. And if it's not a bestseller yet, I think it will be by the end of this conference because it's in the hands of many, many people here. But I was asking Caroline before she came in about, feel free to come on up, Caroline. But I was asking her any interesting travel, and she's got a speaking event she's doing in Costa Rica soon. And her book has really put Canadians, First Nations, and Indigenomics, on the menu in a lot of conferences. And so I think that's something she can be proud of. And I think all of us in the room can definitely be grateful that she could make space for us here today. Her theme is that we're really in a power moment here as a First Nations community, and I want to give her the stage here to allow her to build off of that soundbite of that we are in a power moment. So, Caroline, please join us.
Good. Perfect.
Yeah, actually, let's set it up and then our viewers know. We're just going to do a minor podium adjustment.
Perfect. That's what they do for the short people, I guess. Thank you for the warm welcome and the introduction and the invitation to come and spend time with you today. Uklasish, Caroline Hilton, Heshquiak Supsish Uklas, Wakatushkoatsa Umti. That might be the first time our Nuu-chah-nulth language is spoken in these territories. So I come from the west coast, Vancouver Island of the Nuu-chah-nulth people. My Nuu-chah-nulth name is Wakatush, which means I come from a line of the oldest woman. I'm very excited and absolutely said yes when I heard that this gathering was going on. A lot of my work in Indigenomics is about centering our leadership in the space that we're taking up, in the space that we're creating in the Indigenous economy. So I wanted to focus on that concept of radical inclusion in the low carbon economy and the place in the space that we are building and how formative that has been in terms of our ability to participate, where we've come from, and really essentially bringing focus into this power moment. Some of you may have heard of the concept of Indigenomics, and some of you that may be a new concept, although it seems to have gone around the country and around the world several times. So it's exciting to see the uptake of it and the positivity that it's built on. So I essentially describe Indigenomics as the collective economic response to the lasting legacy of the systemic exclusion of the Indigenous peoples in the development of this country. That is the truth and the space that we have to be able to build from. That uncomfortable space of that realization. You might ask, well, what does that have to do with carbon? What does it have to do with carbon? To actually understand and to be able to look at this concept of Indigenomics by design. Indigenomics is essentially a design platform. It's about designing the experience of our exclusion and designing our future. It's coming to the truths of that experience and beginning to build the foundation of what does Indigenous economic power look like today. To be able to bring focus and light and truth to that concept of the structure of radical exclusion before we come to the position of radical inclusion. So I essentially posit that Indigenous economies, in our whole state, prior to contact or that disruption, was the first stage that we were experienced upon arrival. Looking at this stage specifically, the systemic disruption of existing Indigenous economic systems, our ways of being, and removal from the land, while severing our inherent authority and responsibility to place. This stage in itself required in that stage was entanglement. This stage is essentially characterized by the complexity of the entanglement of the Indigenous relationship, locally, nationally, and internationally. This is firmly embedded within the conflicts stemming from the disruption of our Indigenous ways of being, our epistemologies, and the threat to our continued way of life. It is in this entanglement the complexity of the emergence was firmly established. This third stage, characterized by the emergence of the Indigenous legal environment. This legal context essentially serves to reinforce new, modern economic space for Indigenous nations, businesses, and governments. It is essentially what I describe is that what happens in the legal environment is expressed within our economies. To understand that is essentially, formatively, also what brought us together today. To understand what has shaped the legal forces has allowed us this new space and new opportunity and new relationships. And finally, empowerment. To realize that this stage is characterized by the rise of Indigenous economic empowerment as an effect of the shifting Indigenous rights and titles legal environment, economic equality, and inclusion. This stage essentially sees an increase in Indigenous business development and economic activity as a viable and competitive business model. My work at the national level has essentially been that Indigenous peoples need to get off the cost side of the balance sheet of this country and into the investment of actual economic power. To understand and build focus into this concept of Indian Act economics, it is specifically in this context that this conversation is convoluted within. To understand as a premise that Indigenous peoples were systematically legislated out of the mainstream economy, that the Indians, as it's still referred to in the Indian Act, were systematically uninvited to the economic table. And while the Indian Act was and continues to be a primary tool to serve Indigenous economic exclusion, remaining the sole tool for the continued economic regression of the Indigenous peoples. Again, you might ask, what does this have to do with carbon? It is in this economic space that essentially our ability to bring focus into this concept of the space that we are creating. So moving through these essential concepts of phases that we've gone through, landing that we are in a power moment, to be able to understand and to bring into focus the concept of economic space, the space of what has happened to us, and the creative dimension of establishing our identity, our ways of being, our worldview into economies and coming in as key players that are fundamental to this discussion. But to be able to build specifically within this power center of the Indigenous economy, it is essential to understand and be able to uphold the concept of recognition, the experience of that, the structure of that, and the process of that. The expression of rights and title, representation, which tables that we sit at, which tables we have never been invited into, as well as the resources. Looking at this quadrant of essentially the space of Indigenous economic power, it comes to our attention that this formative moment is largely shaped by that concept within the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And while essentially what is described is the right to an economy, It is also equally important to understand, particularly in this context, that building on that formative truth, Indigenous peoples have been excluded from the economic table. That second to that, Indigenous peoples are the only ones who have had to fight for a right to an economy. Now, coming into focus, to be able to understand and bring a discussion specifically around what is the opportunity for Indigenous leadership in the low-carbon economy. I look to a number of specific examples where we are seeing exemplary, demonstrative, clear, tangible pathways of Indigenous leadership. We look to the concept of the structure of the First Nations Climate Initiative, a collection of 4 nations in a particular hot zone that looking at essentially providing leadership on climate and development policies that are impacting with the foundation of using the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Why is this significant? To have a nation-based, nation-led policy framework that pushes for energy development that meets local and global climate change targets and reduces poverty in Indigenous communities. To look at that specifically from an LNG perspective, the framework essentially supports the concept of building the infrastructure and innovation for the foundation of a low-carbon economy moving towards 2050. Again, the larger context specifically here, resources do not leave Indigenous territories without Indigenous peoples at the table. To be able to bring into focus, and again, to understand that essentially, when we move this into a carbon focus, the opportunity is essentially the structure of Indigenous economy, the big why, the big how. So not only were Indigenous peoples legislated out of the actual economic table, but to understand the perpetuation of that it facilitates the big why, the how, and essentially what we are doing in building the economies and the big purpose behind that. To essentially establish a policy framework in itself is about developing an investment plan that realizes this vision. The second example that I draw upon, I'm not sure if we have anyone here from Indigenous Clean Energy, which I think is an absolutely amazing work and organization. Again, looking at this as a particular structure, collaborative, community-driven clean energy futures, respecting Indigenous lands, treaties, and rights, and enriches their communities. Essentially, clean energy partnerships play a critical role in a low-carbon transition. These are elemental entrance points to be able to understand this emerging narrative. Indigenous partnerships are key to meeting Canada's climate commitments. Again, when we put this specifically within a carbon context, it's building the essential foundation of Indigenous leadership, particularly around the inclusion of energy futures in our economy, positive, meaningful collaboration, and essentially the value chain of how that has shifted. All of that has occurred largely because of our insertion that we are still here, we have rights, we must be recognized, and essentially operating from that place that we are a powerful people. I particularly like this concept of the Indigenous space in a low-carbon economy, which begins to demonstrate and break down the actual economic participation and space of Indigenous people. And while essentially my work at the Institute has been facilitating the structure and design of a $100 billion Indigenous economy, for clean energy, you realize the space for infrastructure, you realize the space for carbon, particularly within that focus. So realizing as the economic driver that essentially to pay attention to the shift that is happening of Indigenous economic power. The realization that emerging numbers, Indigenous communities, are the 3rd largest owners of clean energy in Canada. that Indigenous communities are leading the way on renewable energy, and that essentially the spaces that we have created for ourselves are following much within the carbon context and our ability to facilitate the structure of our own inclusion. To look at the concept of the structures of Indigenous inclusion, we look at two examples of specifically looking at the shifting dimensions of ownership, co-ownership, increased economic benefits, royalty agreements, Indigenous financing, revenue sharing, lease agreements, impact benefit, or partnership agreements, to essentially understand that the carbon context in this country has essentially shifted, that the ability to invest into partnerships and ownership is significantly adapted from what the partnership or the program intention was originally set out to do. We have grown bigger than the programs of regional and national design. To understand that also demonstrates the PowerPoint that we are in, that our ability to facilitate this concept of emerging economic strength. It's in this space that the ability to align the growth of clean energy projects, the growth of structures of Indigenous economy are essential to pay attention to. One of the best examples of an early demonstration of Indigenous leadership in terms of carbon particularly is anyone familiar with the Great Bear Rainforest out of British Columbia? They essentially negotiated one of the early carbon structures with 80% revenue that essentially established a circular economy where the ability to facilitate through those revenue, the carbon revenues, the ability to facilitate actual processes of Indigenous-led conservation, Indigenous management and risk management within the territories, and the ability to facilitate ownership within that structure. As an early demonstration and mover within the carbon markets, essentially, I think it's essential to be able to liken emerging economic strength to the powers, to the structures, and the processes of Indigenous ownership, the access to markets, the access to investment. Again, our ability to bring into focus what is the features or characteristics of this power moment. The realization of essentially having Indigenous people at the table, the value of Indigenous investment, the structures of Indigenous ownership, and essentially facilitating the space of Indigenous visibility within this conversation. How quickly has that shifted? It shifted in our lifetime, and it's shifted within the mandates that essentially describe and establish the Indigenous position within the overall economy. To bring back into focus the concept of ESG, we are seeing that a significant shift of Indigenous inclusion in the concept itself, where the normality of ESGI in itself is establishing the normal, where the requirement of risk, the requirement of impact, and the requirement of outcomes is shifting into the financial and accountability dimension. Again, to put this in the context of the carbon markets, Indigenous inclusion, Indigenous strategic partnership, the struck economic inclusion. It is in this space that our ability to understand the outcomes that we are creating, that it must shift the lived realities of our people to a positive. That essentially this space is about building understanding of the importance of the Indigenous relationship. And finally, what is in front of us? What are we looking at that is the progressive action for economic inclusion? When we look to examples such as Carbon RX, we understand and essentially facilitating to bring the key players, to bring key perspectives, and to be able to facilitate the space of what is next, what are we leading, what is important to us and what is the opportunity. To do that, we must be able to talk about that, essentially the concept that Indigenous peoples have been excluded. To bring into focus the places, the tables, the policies that shape Indigenous inclusion today. That is essentially Indigenomics. To be able to understand the outcomes, that essentially, what is the impact of the lived reality, the possibility of continuation of language and culture, the continuation of care for elders or space for youth, the ability to understand and realize that how significantly, even within a 5-year context, how the carbon market has shifted, how the nature of Indigenous inclusion has shifted, and essentially to be able to bring together the conversations that bring into focus essentially what it is that brings us here today. So in saying that, I wanted to refer directly to the leadership that has allowed these initial structures to be possible, to be able to acknowledge that essentially our place to bring leadership into focus, to have a voice of what we value, and to bring structure to economy in a new way is the opportunity that is in front of us. Again, I wanted to thank the organizers for putting this together, for being able to bring into focus the leadership, the conversations, the projects, and the investment environment, particularly to identify what is the shift and ability to bring into focus why we're here today. We do have some time for question and answers, and I'm happy to take any before we end. You have the mic?
Can I go over the mic while I ask the question? Yeah, I can bring this one forward. Sorry. I'm interested as you've campaigned this topic around the country and talked to audiences wherever, where's it landing with the most impact, or which audiences maybe are struck by it to take the most action? So kind of a two-part question.
I think my work is about what I call educating the capital. For example, just before the Truth and Reconciliation Day, I had the honor of doing a keynote address with the Ontario Teachers Pension Fund. And I think to understand and build a narrative around the importance of adjusting the perception of the Indigenous, able to bring a demonstratable concept of this is what we're looking at in terms of Indigenous economic strength. Absolutely the financial sector. I think absolutely the policy tables to begin to look at how to adapt policy to support investing into Indigenous economic design. The absence of design is largely what the concept of Indigenomics has responded to. Even in my work at the federal level, the realization of federal programs that could be cut at any time, that didn't have an end outcome, that was reflected to Indigenous economic measurements is a lot of what my work has been focused on.
Thank you so much. No, I don't have a question. I'm very appreciative, Caroline, for you to come and spend some time with us today, and certainly bring home the idea of Indigenomics in terms of what we're doing, and I'm really grateful that you covered those things during your presentation. I have a gift for you because I wasn't going to give you your own book signed. What? So I have here a ribbon skirt for you, and I'm not sure if this is something that you wear in your traditional lands, but this is something that's really sacred to us in Treaty 4 territory. And my friend Angel Whitestar actually made this, and she's from Paipot First Nation. And I really just wanted you to have something that you'll remember us by. So I'm gifting this ribbon skirt to you, and I hope that you'll enjoy it and you'll take it with you to ceremonies and share that.
Thank you.
There you
So
go.
Beautiful.
Thank you. Show the group. And that's kind of your colors, right? Like black and white.
Beautiful. Thank
Oh,
you.
you're welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
All right. Thanks, everyone.